What were we talking about?
Well, you were pointing out these buildings of these Greek columns, and you were saying, well, isn't that nice that, they're bringing back that beauty, that Greek beauty. And I was saying that, yes, they are using identifiably Greek forms, but they have isolated those forms, and what makes those forms good is their utility in a system. And Deleuze has that concept of the body without organs, which I interpret to mean it's a whole system which cannot be differentiated into simpler parts. But the use of Ionic or Doric or Corinthian columns standing alone without a complete holistic synthesis of elements working together, those are organs without bodies. So that is this sort of Andy Warhol. I'm going to take a can of soup and I'm just going to replicate it a bunch of times. I'm going to take some Greek columns and just throw them on a bank building. But that completely ignores the spirit where this architecture came from. In the Greek context, those columns and that architecture, the iconic vision, is generated out of a deep religious purpose, that this is the best thing that we can create, and we're going to put our all into it, all of our money, all of our talent, all of our labor. We're going to build these temples in which the beauty is serving its own purpose. It's not, I have a bank and I want it to kind of look better, so I'm going to throw some Greek architecture on top of it. No. It's like the building, the purpose of the building is to be beautiful. It doesn't have any other function. It's not a bank. It's not a hospital. It's not a school. It simply is a temple to beauty itself. And like the temple itself is a beautiful object dedicated to the God, who is in himself or herself like a personification of beauty. So when we ask this question of like, what would it mean to somehow take Greek architecture and bring it to the present day? Is it just about taking the forms? No, because if you just take the forms, that actually kills the spirit. It actually perverts the original spirit of it. And if you just take the spirit in itself without any consideration for the form, then you get like science fiction, or you get modern architecture, which is just like the pursuit of newness in itself, that we should just have like, oh, let's just do something that is crazy or upsets people or is provocative. If you just take the spirit of newness in itself and you completely ignore harmony of forms, then that becomes ugliness. But also, there's a subtle conservative ugliness when you just take the old forms and you just put them in the modern day. Like someone dresses up in a Revolutionary War outfit or something, like the LARPers or historical reenactors. Like, that's not cool. But there is there is such a thing as beauty, there is such a thing as coolness, and that coolness and that beauty is found when you have the right spirit and the right forms. You have the right animating outward principle, and you have the right, it's like the harmony of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. You have to have that, and it's difficult. It's not easy. That's what makes beauty so special, is that it's rare and it's hard. If it was easy, it wouldn't be valuable. And so there is like a really delicate balance you need there. I think of someone like Michelangelo in the Renaissance, who's making all these diagrams of helicopters. Now, if Michelangelo was alive today, he would not be making those same diagrams, because he was not just an artist, he was a scientist, and he would look at the existing helicopters and he would build off of that. So when we ask, what does neoclassical architecture look like in the present day? It does not look like a bank building with Corinthian columns. It does not also look like science fiction or modern art. Really what it looks like is we have to ask our question, what was the intention of the Greeks when they made that architecture? And we have to understand that intention. It wasn't just to create things which were unique and new, although that was part of it. I would also look at the Cologne Cathedral. Right, the Baroque architecture, it was something new, but it wasn't just the pure spirit, like a Promethean spirit absent of anything else. That's a component of it. It's like balancing the seven liberal arts or balancing the four humors. Like that's a consideration, that there has to be something new. We're not just going to replicate something from the past and bring it into the present. What we have to do is we have to take that attitude and the spirit of, we're going to make the best thing that we can make. And for the Greeks, when you look at those Greek temples and you realize they didn't have the modern technology, they did not have the cranes, and they didn't have the steel rebar to put inside the columns, and they didn't have all of these different types of they didn't have all these machines and bobcats or whatever modern construction uses to make buildings. They didn't have that. And so they were using their hands and their feet and like pulley systems with ropes. And they're using very quote unquote primitive technology. Now, the fact that we have all this new technology means that if we are to truly continue that tradition, we're not simply going to make a building the size of the Parthenon. We're going to make something 10 times bigger than the Parthenon. We're going to make something megalithic on a scale that's never been done before, because we have the technology to do that. And so the Greeks exhausted themselves. I mean, there were probably people who died building those temples, and I don't know what the labor conditions of, but I'm thinking of the pyramids of Greece, or not Greece, but Giza in Egypt, where, they're slaves and they're dying, and it's like toiling and hardship. Like, we should be like working our fingers to the bone if we want to match the Greeks. We can't just replicate the form. We can't just make, we'll just recreate the Parthenon. No, that's not what they did. It's not. Stop thinking about the form. Stop thinking about the object and the destination. Start thinking about the animating spirit. That is the desire to work so hard and on an architectural project that you say there's literally nothing more that we could have done. We put 100% into it. That's what they did, and that's what we would need to do today, and that's what we don't do today. We don't have a state that's like, you know what? This year, 10% of the government budget is going to be put into an architectural project. We don't have that today. We sort of had that maybe a little bit with the space race, but I think to do it today, you would need some kind of transcontinental, maglev train from New York to LA. Like, it would be that scale and scope of a transcontinental railroad, and all along, I don't want to see a big wall on the southern border. That's not the type of architecture I want to see, because that's useless. That's symbolic in a negative sense. It's we want to keep these people out. We want to keep America great. America's not great. I'm sorry. The left is right about this. America is not great in this sense of magnanimity, the sense of this outward spirit. Like, it's we kind of have this sick culture, and so we don't want to keep out Mexicans to keep America great. We don't want to save the suburbs from the Mexican cartels. Not to say that I'm in favor of Mexican cartels, but just to say that maybe we live in a more human world if the animating spirit of America was Mexican cartels instead of the suburbs. So when Trump says, I want to save the suburbs from the Mexican cartels, I'm like, that's like saying I want to, save save somebody from, I want to save this cancer tumor from being excised from a body or something like that. It's really sick, and we need to get away from the construction of the wall that the right wing has been obsessed with for, I guess, we're coming up 5-6 years eventually. I guess 2015, wow, that really was 6 years ago when he came down the escalator. No, we need to throw that in the trash and say, if we're going to have a big, beautiful vision of actually creating something positive and constructive, it should be something like a transcontinental the fastest train. We want it faster than the Japanese. If we have to go hire Japanese engineers, heck, we'll invite 1 million Japanese over, and they can build the thing even better than they did it in their own country, because we'll have all the resources of America poured into it, and it's going to be a new wonder of the world. That's what the Greeks were trying to do. They were trying to create wonders of the world. No one has ever made anything this spectacular. Can we say that about anything that we make today? Anything? There is no spirit, which is all of our creativity that's in the left, is actually trapped in this false anti-authoritarian hypocrisy. We're always going to have authority. We're always going to have rules and structures. When you look at the separation of sexuality in our culture, that, well, first I have my sex, and then I have my gender identity, and then I'm panromantic, aromantic. You have all these rules and laws and words to define our sexuality, our romance, our identity. Nothing can be left to the intuitive side of things. And that we've lost something in our humanity if we can only operate at the level of the superficial, conscious things that we can provide labels and words for. And so the left makes this mistake when they say, like, oh yeah, well, we're just doing things that are creative and new, because they're not recognizing that your definition of what's creative and new ultimately derives from some sort of authority. And so you have to kind of like call that out and acknowledge it and have a reverence for it and respect for it, which they do, but they do it in a very hypocritical way that ends up being ugly. Whereas the right says, we're just going to reproduce the words and the forms of, like, we'll recite Shakespeare. If Shakespeare was alive today, Shakespeare would not be writing in Shakespearean English. There's nothing special about Shakespearean English. What's special actually is the innovative capacity of Shakespeare to create new phrases, new idioms in the English language. That's what's so valuable about Shakespeare, is he's willing to take the language, to master the language, and to build upon it. And so, you can't really build anything if you don't have a proper perspective and respect. And this is why I love the term deep left, because the left in itself, like if we remove the word deep and we're just talking about left, then the left in itself really represents this spirit of newness and creativity. And if there's no depth to that, and what Heidegger says is that all of the depth of the human experience comes from our sense of death. Death and depth are related to one another. And so if that's the case, then to have a left, to have a creative spirit that also has depth to it, that has a deepness to it, I think that it is the correct merger of the two. It is the correct perspective, as opposed to a conservatism which thinks that it's all about depth, but actually we can't have even the concept of death without the concept of life. We need to have these concepts, are in some kind of syndiphonesis with each other. They're connected. You can't have one without the other. So conservatives need to stop trying to bring back neoclassical architecture by making it a window dressing, by making it an outward form. No, if you're going to build a Greek temple, it better have a statue of Artemis or Apollo or someone in there. Like, you better be worshiping that thing. Like, and we can have that today. We can have people feel so atheistic and secular. And the Romans went through the same thing, and they found Christianity, and now we feel the same way about Christianity that the Romans felt about paganism, that it's hollow and it's empty and it's an old ritual. And maybe if you're a conservative, you say, oh, I wish we could go back to those days, but we can't. It's been poisoned, it's been run through the mud, and for the Romans, that was that experience of the Republic falling and the Empire rising. There was a great deal of cynicism in what Caesar did. I mean, yeah, Caesar was a great man in many respects, but also you look at that political transformation, how that came about is because the Republic was so corrupt. That's why it fell and became an empire. That's why you needed a tyrant like Caesar to take power, is because the system was so rotten and weak. And so that was rottenness, the rottenness and the weakness was the result of the fact that the empire overextended itself. It tried to do too much Romano interpretatio. It tried to absorb all these cultures of the Mediterranean, and in the process it lost itself. It lost its frame of reference. It lost its confidence and its faith in its own culture, and it just became so cosmopolitan that it had no orientation in the world. And so in that total vacuum of confidence and faith, you had these fanatical people called the Christians, and they were the ones who came out on top eventually. And so now we have a situation where you've got these Christians who are saying, well, we just need to go back to the way it was, and they're looking at these BLM people and these, radical leftists, and they're saying, oh, that's terrible, that's iconoclastic, and I sympathize. I don't want to see statues torn down, but at the same time, we have to understand that when we have become nihilistic, when we have become empty, when we have become secular, the only way we're going to get out of this is through something that looks like fanaticism, and it's not going to ever be, and it never has been, a fanaticism for the past. There's no such thing as fanatical nostalgia. Nostalgia is always this kind of dour, conservative, oh, I remember my childhood days and things were simpler back then. No, that's not the spirit that ushers in a new age. It has to be like completely fanatical and paradoxical, and it doesn't make sense, and it's like saying, men are women and women are men. Who said that before? It was St. Paul, right? When he said men and women are one in Christ Jesus. So these kind of paradoxes that we're seeing today, the people want to say, oh, if we could only go back to the pagan times, if only Plato hadn't messed it all up, if only we could go back to before Plato. It's like, no, this is how history works. We get ourselves, because we learn more, because culture changes, technology changes, we encounter new cultures, we lose faith in ourselves, and we need to resynthesize and reintegrate. And that process is always violent. It's almost like I want to say, rather than physical sex, it's like cultural sex. Like there's something kind of nasty about it. There's something sort of dirty about it, but there's also something life-affirming about it, and there's something necessary about it, and that you can't just be an anti-natalist conservative and say, no, this is gross, I don't want to deal with this. Like, it's a part of life. You need to deal with it in one way. You need to recognize the necessity of what's going on, and you can try to balance the way that you think it's going too far in one direction or another. But we're going to go through this process. And by the way, it's not going to be the collapse of civilization. And the coming of Christianity was not the collapse of civilization. I think it was Guillaume Fay who said that the Middle Ages was one of the most profoundly, deeply intellectual, transformative periods of Europe. Before and after, if you look at all of the processing of Christian philosophy and Peter Abelard and nominalism and all these intellectual revolutions, that was, in a sense, the greatest changes that were happening. In many ways that we look at the changes that are happening today in new sexual identity movements, oh, this is so drastic. I remember the 1990s when things were, you had Don't Ask, Don't Tell with Bill Clinton, and things have changed so quickly. But really, we haven't. I mean, because if you think about it, you have these heteronormative norms from Christianity for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then in the 1960s, you decriminalize homosexuality. That's a much bigger cultural shift than the difference between decriminalizing homosexuality and now having gender-neutral bathrooms. And so there's a very myopic perspective that conservatives have where they can only see what's right in front of them, and they cannot see like these long arcs of history. Not to say that the left is better about this all the time. They can be just as myopic. But that in order to really understand history, to understand what's going on, and to have a clear vision of what's happening, then you have to be able to kind of dissociate yourself from this attachment to this nostalgia for these old forms, and you also have to dissociate yourself from this need simply for a pure newness, for a pure creativity, for a pure, Dionysian, hippie style, up is down and down is up and we can do anything we want. You have to come to that understanding. And I think when we look at Plato as a religious revolutionary, or we look at Hesiod, or we look at Christ, or we look at the Buddha, all of these religious revolutionaries, Zoroaster, they're all knowledgeable in the systems of their time. The real people who create change in the world are not merely these kind of like Joan of Arc, shamanic, like idiot savants where they have no clue what's doing, and they're just like the hidden hand of history appearing prophetically. No, these people were wise. These people understood what they were doing. They understood the sociological, psychological. They understood the biological even, in ways that we have lost contact with because we've become so superficial and conscious, and everything has to be very descriptive, and there's no mystery anymore. All these guys came out of the mystery schools, and that sense of intuitive understanding, that I understand a thing intuitively, it's second nature to me. I don't need to use my conscious mind to analytically break down what's happening in the social scene. I can just kind of thrust myself into it, and I understand it. I understand that the music sounds good, and I understand that the words are said well, and I don't need to stop and break it down. So I think an understanding is necessary, and I think that the journey is long. I think this is the process that has to happen in order for us to get to the other side. It doesn't mean that we ourselves, like John the Baptist, he never saw Christendom, like he never saw the Christian kingdoms, right? But he was this integral part of that. So that's something we have to recognize, that when you're in the midst of a religious revolution, you're not going to see an end to the conflict. You're not going to see a resolution. You're not going to see the new religion, whatever that looks like or whatever that means to you. But if you want to be a part of that process, it takes deep understanding, and you can't have this one-sided approach where you simply go back, or you simply, everything that's old is bad, or everything new is good, or the reverse, everything new that is bad and everything old is good. I'm thinking of the way that Christ comes and he just completely smashes all these kosher laws, but also says not one iota of the old law will pass away. And so these are contradictions, and these are paradoxes, and they're things that are basically challenges to us that we have to work through, whether it's in music or art or architecture or the way that we think about politics. We cannot simply, there's no one-sided, easy, superficial answer to any of these questions. You have to think a little bit deeper than that. So chew on that for a little bit, and just mull it over, and maybe you'll see what I'm thinking. Until next time, take care now. Bye-bye. There you go. Are we